The banging on my door came so hard that my coffee mug rattled off the counter and shattered on the floor. I froze, staring at the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nobody knocked like that unless something was wrong. I lived alone. 4th floor, no elevator, a building where the heater barely worked and the hallway lights flickered like they were dying. At 11 at night, in the middle of a storm that had been howling since sunset, a knock like that meant trouble. I almost didn't open it. I stood there with my hand hovering over the lock, telling myself to call the police instead, to look through the peephole first, to do anything except what I actually did, which was open the door. I had lived in this building for 3 years, long enough to know every ordinary sound it made, the groan of the pipes at midnight, the upstairs neighbor's television turned too loud, the wind pushing against the old windows whenever a storm rolled through. None of those sounds had ever made me feel unsafe before, but there was something about the knock that had just come, uneven and desperate, that didn't belong to any of the sounds I knew. A man was slumped against the wall outside my apartment. Rain had soaked him through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his jacket torn at the shoulder. There was blood at his temple, thin and dark, mixing with the rainwater running down his jaw. His eyes found mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. "Please," he said. His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. "I just need somewhere to sit down." I should have shut the door. Every rational thought in my head told me to shut the door, but he looked like he was about to collapse right there in the hallway, and something in his face, exhausted and desperate, made my hand let go of the lock instead of turning it. "Who are you?" I asked, not moving aside yet. "Daniel," he said, "I swear I'm not going to hurt you. I just need a minute. Somewhere warm." Thunder cracked outside, loud enough that the hallway light flickered again. He flinched at the sound, and that flinch, small and human, was what decided it for me. I stepped back and let him in. He didn't so much walk into my apartment as fall into it, catching himself on the back of my couch before he could hit the floor. I shut the door behind him and locked it, though by then I wasn't sure if I was locking danger out or locking it in with me. "You're bleeding," I said, grabbing the first aid kit from under my sink. My hands were shaking as I opened it. I had never used most of what was inside. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, but he let me press a cloth to his temple anyway. Up close, I could see the cut wasn't deep, but it had bled enough to look frightening in the dim light. His clothes were expensive, or had been once. A tailored jacket, now torn and soaked through. Shoes that cost more than my monthly rent, scuffed and muddy. "What happened to you?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved around my apartment, quick and sharp, taking in the door, the window, the fire escape outside it, like he was mapping every way in and out. It should have scared me more than it did. Instead, I found myself watching him with a strange kind of fascination, the way you watch a storm from behind glass, knowing you're safe, but aware of how much power is out there anyway. "I got into trouble," he finally said. "Wrong place, wrong people. Should I call someone? A hospital? The police?" His head snapped up at that, and for the first time since he'd stumbled through my door, I saw something sharp behind the exhaustion in his eyes. "No police," he said, too fast, too firm. Then, softer, like he realized how it sounded. "Please, no police. I just need to sit for a while. I'll be gone before it's light out." I should have pushed harder. I should have asked more questions, but there was something about the way he said it, "please," that made me back down. I found a towel and handed it to him instead, along with a dry shirt that used to belong to an ex-boyfriend who never bothered coming back for his things. "Bathroom's through there," I said, pointing. "You can change. I'll make tea." He looked at me for a long moment before he stood, his legs unsteady but holding. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to let me in." "No," I agreed. "I didn't." While he was in the bathroom, I stood in my kitchen with my hands braced on the counter, breathing slowly, trying to talk myself down from the edge of panic I'd been standing on since I opened that door. My phone was right there. I could have called someone. A friend. My sister. Anyone who would tell me I was being reckless letting a bleeding stranger into my apartment in the middle of the night. Instead, I put the kettle on. When he came out, he looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a shirt too loose for his frame. his wet hair pushed back from his face. Without the jacket, without the confidence he must have been wearing like armor before whatever happened to him happened, he looked younger, more like someone who had been running from something rather than someone who caused fear in others. "Sit," I said, nodding at the small table by my window. He sat, and I set a cup of tea in front of him, then sat across from him with my own cup, mostly for something to hold on to. "You're not going to ask me more questions," he said, watching me over the rim of his cup. "Would you answer them?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone so fast I almost missed it. "Probably not. Then I'll save us both the trouble." We sat in silence after that, the storm still raging outside, rain hammering against the window in sheets. I studied him without meaning to. The cut on his temple had stopped bleeding. His hands, wrapped around the mug, were steady now, though I noticed the way his eyes kept drifting to the door every few minutes, like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. "Do you have somewhere else you're supposed to be tonight?" I asked. "Someone who's worried about you?" Something flickered across his face, there and gone, too complicated for me to name. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight, nobody knows where I am. That's sort of the point. That sounds lonely. It's safer this way," he said, and something in the way he said safer made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Safer for who? I wondered, but didn't ask. I thought, briefly, of my mother, who used to say that kindness offered without conditions was the only kind worth giving, and that most people who needed help had already been turned away by someone before they reached your door. I had spent years trying to live by that, in small ways, giving directions to lost tourists, letting a coworker cry in the break room without asking why. I had never expected it to lead me here, sitting across from a stranger with blood at his temple and secrets in his eyes. But some stubborn part of me refused to regret it, even with the fear still sitting heavy in my chest. The clock on my wall ticked past midnight. I offered him the couch, the only spare place to sleep in my one-room apartment, and he accepted without argument, though he insisted on staying dressed, shoes by the door, like he might need to leave at any moment. I gave him a blanket and a spare pillow, and told myself this was just a kindness, nothing more. One stranger helping another on a bad night. That was all it had to be. "Why did you let me in?" he asked, as I turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the small lamp by the couch glowing. I thought about it for a moment. The honest answer, the one I wasn't ready to say out loud, was that something about the look on his face when I opened the door had reminded me of every time I had needed help and hadn't gotten it. But I settled for something simpler. "You looked like you needed it," I said, "and I couldn't just leave you out there." He didn't say anything to that, just watched me with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between gratitude and something heavier, something that looked almost like guilt. "Get some sleep," I told him, and went to my room, shutting the door most of the way, but not all the way, some instinct telling me to leave it open just enough to hear if something happened. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain slow to a drizzle, listening for any sound from the living room that might tell me I'd made a terrible mistake. But there was nothing, just the quiet creak of the couch as he shifted, and once, so soft I almost missed it, what sounded like him whispering a name that wasn't mine. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, the kind where every sound outside felt like it might be the last one I heard. I dreamed of doors that wouldn't lock, and hallways that stretched too long. When I finally sank into something deeper, it was with the strange, quiet certainty that whoever I had let into my apartment that night was not just a man who had gotten into trouble. He was someone trouble had been looking for. And by letting him in, I had let it find me too. I just didn't know it yet. The smell of coffee pulled me out of sleep before my alarm did. For a moment, lying there with my eyes still closed, I thought I must have imagined it, some trick of a half-dream. Then I remembered the storm, the knock, the stranger on my couch, and I sat up so fast the room spun. I opened my bedroom door slowly, half expecting the apartment to be empty, my first aid kit, and spare blanket the only proof that any of it had actually happened. Instead, I found him standing at my small kitchen counter, fully dressed, hair combed back, the cut on his temple cleaned and barely visible now. He had found my coffee maker and was pouring 2 cups like he had done it 100 times before, in a kitchen that wasn't his. He looked nothing like the man who had collapsed against my hallway wall the night before. Gone was the desperate, shaking figure soaked through with rain. In his place stood someone composed, still, watching me with an expression that gave nothing away. His jacket was gone, but the shirt he wore now, one I didn't recognize, fit him perfectly, like it had appeared out of nowhere while I was asleep. His posture had changed too. Where he had leaned on my furniture for support last night, now he stood with a kind of stillness that made the small kitchen feel smaller, like the air itself had rearranged around him. "Good morning," he said, sliding a cup toward me across the counter. His voice was different too, steadier, lower somehow, with none of the roughness from the night before. "You're better," I said, because it was the only thing I could think to say. "A good night's sleep does wonders," he said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup, more to have something to hold than because I wanted it. "Where did you get a clean shirt?" "I had it sent over," he said simply, as though that explained everything, as though it were completely ordinary to have clothes delivered to a stranger's apartment before sunrise. That was when I noticed the window. I hadn't opened the curtains yet, but there was a gap where the fabric didn't quite meet, and through it I could see the street below. 2 black cars were parked outside my building, engines idling, exhaust curling into the cold morning air. Beside them stood several men in dark coats, standing too straight, too alert, their eyes methodically sweeping the street, the windows, the rooftops. One of the men outside glanced up toward my window, and though I doubted he could see me through the narrow gap in the curtain, I stepped back instinctively, my pulse quickening. There was something in the way they stood, patient and unhurried, that told me they weren't waiting for a bus or a delivery. They were waiting for him. "Daniel," I said slowly, my stomach beginning to tighten, "who are those men?" He followed my gaze to the window, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but a kind of resignation, like he had known this moment was coming and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. He set his cup down carefully on the counter. "They work for me," he said. "Work for you, doing what?" He was quiet for a moment, studying me the way you might study something fragile, deciding how much weight it could hold before it broke. "Keeping me alive, mostly," he said, "making sure people like the ones who did this to me last night don't get a second chance." My hand tightened around my cup. "Last night, you said you got into trouble. Wrong place, wrong people." That was true. But that's not the whole truth, is it? He didn't answer right away, and his silence was answer enough. I set my cup down, my hands no longer entirely steady, and took a step back from the counter, putting a small but deliberate distance between us. "Who are you?" I said again, and this time it wasn't really a question, it was a demand. He held my gaze, and for the first time since he'd stepped through my door, he didn't try to soften what he was about to say. "My name is Daniel Ashcroft," he said. "Some people call me other things. Boss, sir, a few names I won't repeat in front of you. Last night, some men who don't like the way I run things decided it was a good time to try to change that. I got away, barely, and I ended up on your doorstep because it was the only door on that street I thought no one would think to check." The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago, like the walls had drawn in while he spoke. "You mean I was random?" I said. "You picked my door because it was safe for you, not because of anything about me."
"At first," he admitted.
"But that's not why I'm still standing here now." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, just watched him, trying to reconcile the shivering stranger from the night before with the man standing in my kitchen now, calm and certain, with armed men waiting for him outside. "You should have told me," I said finally. "Last night. You should have told me what I was letting into my home." "Would you have opened the door if I had?" I wanted to say yes, because it felt important to say yes, to prove that my kindness hadn't been built on ignorance. But the honest answer was that I didn't know, and we both understood that I didn't know, and neither of us said it out loud. I sat down slowly at my small table, my legs suddenly unwilling to hold me the way they had a moment ago. Everything about the night before rearranged itself in my mind, the careful way he had scanned the room for exits, the flinch at the sound of thunder that I had mistaken for simple fear, rather than the practiced instincts of someone who had learned to survive violence long before that storm ever reached my street. I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner, and frightened for exactly the same reason. "I'm not going to apologize for surviving," he said, quieter now. "But I am sorry for the position I've put you in. That part is real." "What position have you put me in?" He hesitated, and that hesitation frightened me more than anything he had said so far. "The men who attacked me last night, they don't know about you. Not yet. As far as anyone knows, I disappeared into the storm and came out the other side alone. If it stays that way, you have nothing to worry about. And if it doesn't stay that way?" He didn't answer that either, and I understood, in the silence that followed, that some things were kinder left unsaid. He reached into the inside pocket of the jacket that had been draped over my chair, the same jacket that had been soaked through and torn the night before, now somehow dry and mended, and pulled out a plain white card. There was nothing on it except a string of numbers, no name, no logo, nothing that would mean anything to anyone who found it by accident. "If anything strange happens," he said, holding it out to me, "anyone follows you, anyone asks questions about you that they shouldn't be asking, anyone comes near this apartment who isn't supposed to be here, you call this number. Any hour. It doesn't matter what time it is. Someone will answer." I looked at the card in his hand but didn't take it right away. "You're scaring me." "I know," he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, an apology folded inside two words. "I wish I could tell you there was nothing to be scared of. I can't. But I can tell you that, whatever happens now, you are not unprotected. Not anymore." I took the card, finally, my fingers brushing his as I did, and something about the contact felt heavier than it should have, like a door quietly closing somewhere I couldn't see. "Last night," I said, "you said thank you, like it meant something, like I'd done something bigger than just letting a stranger sleep on my couch. You have no idea what you did," he said, and for the first time, his composure cracked just slightly, something raw showing through underneath. "Do you know what it means, in my world, for someone to open their door to a man who came to them broken, with nothing to offer, no name, no protection, and help him anyway? Most people would have called the police. Most people would have slammed the door and pretended they never saw me. You didn't." "I almost did," I admitted. "But you didn't," he said again, like that was the only part that mattered. He moved toward the door then, pausing with his hand on the handle, and looked back at me one more time. "I'll find a way to repay this," he said, "one way or another." "I don't want to be repaid," I said. "I want to go back to my normal life." Something flickered across his face at that, something that looked almost like regret, though I couldn't be sure. "I hope you get to," he said. "I really do." And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, and I stood alone in my kitchen, listening to the sound of car doors closing outside, engines starting, tires pulling away from the curb. I went to the window and watched the black cars disappear down the street until the road was empty again, quiet, ordinary, like nothing at all had happened. I looked down at the card still in my hand, the numbers staring back at me, and felt, for the first time since I had opened my door the night before, the full weight of what I had done. I had let a stranger into my home out of nothing but instinct and kindness, and by sunrise, that stranger had revealed himself to be something far larger, far more dangerous, than anything I could have imagined. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I would never need to use that number, that whatever world Daniel Ashcroft belonged to was a world that would close back over him like water and leave no trace behind in mine. I was wrong about that too. I went to work that morning like it was any other day, showering, dressing, walking the 6 blocks to the small marketing firm where I had spent the last 3 years answering phones and drafting emails nobody read twice. I told myself the whole way there that I would put the card in a drawer somewhere and forget it existed, that whatever had happened in my apartment overnight belonged to the night, and daylight would wash it away like it hadn't happened at all. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, searching the faces of strangers on the sidewalk for anyone paying too much attention to me. Nobody was, or if they were far better at hiding it than I was at noticing. By the time I reached my desk, I had almost convinced myself that the whole night had been some strange, isolated event, a story I would tell at parties years from now, the time a stranger showed up soaked and bleeding, and turned out to be someone important. A story with an ending, closed and complete. I didn't know yet that the story hadn't ended at all. It had only just begun. 3 days passed, and nothing happened. No strange cars outside my building, no unfamiliar faces lingering too long on my street, no phone calls in the middle of the night. I began to relax, slowly, the way you relax after a scare that turns out to be nothing, your shoulders unclenching, bit by bit, until you almost forget they had ever been tight in the first place. I even started to wonder if I had exaggerated the whole thing in my head, if Daniel had simply been a man in over his head, with some bad business associates, dramatic in the way people are dramatic when adrenaline and fear are involved. I put his card in the bottom drawer of my desk, under old bills and a broken phone charger, and told myself I would probably never look at it again. I noticed small things during those quiet days that I might have dismissed before. A car idling too long outside the coffee shop, a man on the train who never looked at his phone or his book, just stared straight ahead, and once, a delivery driver who buzzed my building's intercom for an apartment number that didn't exist. Individually, none of it meant anything. Together, it built a low, steady hum of unease that followed me from room to room, like a shadow I couldn't shake off. Then, on the 4th day, my coworker Grace leaned over the divider between our desks, with a strange look on her face. "Hey," she said, keeping her voice low. "This is going to sound weird, but did you know someone was asking about you at the coffee place on the corner? The one you always go to before work." My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice light. "Asking what?" "Just like, if you came in every day, what time, if you usually came alone." Grace shrugged, like it was nothing, like it was gossip, and not a warning. "I only know because Elena, the barista, told me. She thought it was strange enough to mention. Do you have some secret admirer or something?" I forced a laugh that felt hollow even to me. Maybe, who knows? But I didn't believe that, not for a second. That night, I walked home a different way than usual, taking 2 extra turns I didn't need to take, glancing behind me more times than I could count. Nothing seemed out of place, no one seemed to be following me. But the feeling stayed with me anyway, a low hum of unease that wouldn't quiet down no matter how many times I told myself I was imagining things. 2 days after that, I came home from work to find my apartment exactly as I had left it. Almost exactly. The books on my shelf, which I always kept in a particular order, a habit from childhood I'd never grown out of, were slightly rearranged, not messy, not obviously disturbed, just subtly wrong, the way a room looks wrong when someone has been in it and tried very hard to make it look like they hadn't. My heart began to pound as I walked slowly through the rest of the apartment, checking every corner, every closet, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle of my kitchen knife, though I had no real plan for what I would do with it if I found someone there. I checked behind the shower curtain first, then under the bed, then the narrow closet by the front door, each empty space giving me only a moment of relief before the next one demanded checking too. The apartment was empty, nothing was missing. My laptop was still on the table, my jewelry, what little I had, still in its box on the dresser. I sat down on the edge of my bed afterward, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that maybe I had simply misremembered the order of the books, that grief and stress could make a person doubt even the most familiar details of their own home. But I knew, somewhere beneath the desperate need to believe it, that I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been here, careful and quiet, moving through my space like they had every right to. But on my kitchen counter, sitting where it hadn't been that morning, was a single folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. There was no threat written on it, no demand, nothing that could be traced back to anyone. Just a short line of text, typed, no signature. "You are being watched, not by us." I read it 3 times before the meaning fully settled into my chest, cold and sharp. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had left this note. Not to frighten me into silence, but to warn me. Which meant whoever left it wasn't the danger. It meant there was a different danger circling closer, one I hadn't seen yet, one that had already found its way inside my home once. I stood frozen in my kitchen for a long time, the paper still in my hand, trying to decide what to do. Calling the police felt useless. What would I even tell them? That someone broke in and left a cryptic note but took nothing? They would think I was overreacting. Or worse, they would ask questions about who might be watching me, and I had no answers that wouldn't sound insane out loud. I thought about the card in my desk drawer at work, and for the first time since Daniel had pressed it into my hand, I understood why he had given it to me. This was exactly the moment he had been preparing me for. I didn't have the card with me. It was miles away, buried under old receipts in my desk, but some part of my mind, the part that had spent 3 days memorizing that string of numbers without meaning to, without even realizing I was doing it, still remembered it perfectly. I picked up my phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and dialed. It rang once before someone answered. "This line is for emergencies," said a voice I didn't recognize. Calm, clipped, professional. "Someone was in my apartment," I said, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "They left a note. It says I'm being watched, but not by them. I don't know what that means. I don't know who to call except this number." There was a brief pause, then the voice said, "Stay where you are. Lock every door and window. Someone will be there within the hour." The line went dead before I could ask any more questions, and I stood there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, staring at nothing, trying to remember how to breathe normally. I did as I was told. I locked the door, checked the latch twice, then a third time. I closed the curtains, though some part of me knew that if someone truly wanted to watch me, thin fabric wouldn't stop them. I sat on my couch, the same couch Daniel had slept on only days before, and waited, the note still clutched in my hand, like it might disappear if I let go. 40 minutes later, there was a knock on my door, quieter and more controlled than the frantic pounding that had started all of this. I looked through the peephole before opening it, my hand hovering over the lock the way it had that first night, though this time for entirely different reasons. Daniel stood in the hallway, no longer soaked or bleeding, dressed in dark, tailored clothes that made him look every bit as composed and powerful as he had the morning after I first met him. Behind him stood 2 of the men I recognized from the black cars outside my building days before, silent and watchful. I opened the door, and he stepped inside without waiting to be invited, his eyes immediately scanning the apartment the way they had the very first night, searching for anything out of place. "Show me the note," he said, his voice tight with a kind of urgency I hadn't heard from him before. I handed it over, and he read it in seconds, his jaw tightening as he did. He turned to the men behind him and said something low, too quiet for me to catch, and one of them immediately left, phone already pressed to his ear. "What does it mean?" I asked. "You are being watched, not by us. Watched by who?" Daniel folded the note carefully and slid it into his pocket, his expression unreadable, though I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands had curled slightly at his sides. "It means someone got into your apartment," he said, "and it means they wanted you to know they could have hurt you and chose not to." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No," he admitted. "It's supposed to tell you something important. Whoever left this isn't your enemy, not yet. They're telling you that someone else is watching you, someone who might be." "Who?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him weigh how much to tell me, the same way he had weighed it that first morning in my kitchen. Finally, he sat down across from me, his posture straight, his voice low and even, like he was trying very hard to keep whatever he was feeling contained. "The men who attacked me the night I came to your door," he said. "They didn't act alone. Someone inside my own organization helped them. Someone I trusted. I've been trying to find out who since that night, quietly, without causing a panic that might let them cover their tracks. It seems they found out I was looking, and it seems they found out about you." The room felt very cold suddenly, despite the heater humming in the corner. "So someone in your world knows I exist," I said slowly. "Someone dangerous." "Yes. And the note. If it's not from them, then who left it?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But someone got into your apartment without leaving any trace of forced entry. That takes skill most ordinary people don't have. It means whoever left it either has training or resources, possibly both. It could be someone loyal to me, trying to warn you without revealing themselves. It could be someone playing a longer game I haven't figured out yet. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to steady myself, trying to process the fact that in the span of a single week, my quiet, ordinary life had become tangled up in something with layers I couldn't begin to map. "I never asked for any of this," I said. "I just opened a door." "I know," he said, and there was real weight in his voice, real guilt. "And I meant what I told you before. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure nothing happens to you because of what you did that night. How exactly do you plan to do that?" He looked at me steadily, and something in his expression shifted into something more resolved, more certain, like whatever debate had been happening behind his eyes had finally settled. "I'm going to have someone stationed near your building," he said. "Not obvious, not intrusive, just close enough to respond if anything happens. And I want you to keep that number saved, somewhere you can reach it quickly, not buried in a drawer." I blinked at him. "How did you know it was in a drawer?" The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, the first real hint of humor I had seen from him since he'd walked through my door that night. "Lucky guess," he said, though I suspected it wasn't a guess at all. We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of everything settling around us. The man who had left to make a phone call returned and murmured something to Daniel, who nodded once, his expression hardening slightly, before smoothing back into calm. "Could it have been Elena?" I asked suddenly, the name surfacing from some half-formed memory of gossip I had barely paid attention to, a name Grace had mentioned once, though I quickly realized my mistake. "Sorry, I don't even know why I said that. I don't know anyone by that name involved in any of this." Daniel's eyes sharpened with an interest I didn't understand. "What made you think of that name?" "I didn't, really," I admitted. "It's the barista at the coffee shop Grace mentioned. Different person, I think. Forget I said anything." He nodded slowly, though something in his expression told me the coincidence had lodged itself somewhere in his mind regardless. A small thread he would likely pull on later, once he had time to consider it properly. "They're already checking the security footage from your building," he told me. "If anyone came in or out who shouldn't have, we'll know soon." "You have access to my building's security footage." "I have access to a great many things," he said, and I couldn't tell if it was meant to comfort me or unsettle me further. Perhaps it was both. "How many people even know about what happened to you that night?" I asked, trying to understand the size of the world I had accidentally stepped into. "How many people know my name now?" "Fewer than you'd think," he said. "I've kept this as contained as I can. Noah knows. The man who checked your building's cameras. A handful of others I trust completely. Beyond that, I've made sure your name stays out of anything that could be traced or repeated. But Elena might know. Whoever betrayed you might have already told the people hunting you." "That's my fear too," he admitted. "Which is exactly why I need to move quickly, before whatever they know about you turns into something they decide to use." "I don't know how to live like this," I admitted quietly, staring down at my hands, looking over my shoulder, wondering if every stranger on the street knows something about me that I don't know about myself. "You won't have to live like this forever," he said. "I promise you that. I intend to find whoever did this, and I intend to make sure they can never threaten you again." Something about the certainty in his voice, the quiet, controlled anger beneath it, should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, I found myself believing him, trusting a man I had known for less than a week, a man whose world was built on danger and secrecy, because in that moment, he was the only steady thing in a situation that had otherwise spun completely out of my control. Before he left that night, he paused at the door, the same way he had that first morning, and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm sorry you're caught up in this. You didn't deserve any of it." "No," I agreed. "I didn't, but I'm still here, and apparently, so is whoever left that note." He nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what I meant, and then he was gone again, leaving me alone in my apartment with a note tucked into his pocket, and a promise I wasn't sure either of us could keep. I didn't sleep much that night, lying awake and listening to every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street below, wondering how many more nights like this one were still ahead of me. Somewhere out there, someone knew my name, knew my address, knew enough about my life to slip inside it without leaving a trace. And somewhere out there, Daniel Ashcroft was hunting them, and I understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in my chest, that whatever happened next, I was no longer just a bystander in this story. I had become part of it. Over the following week, my apartment stopped feeling like a place of safety and started feeling like the center of something much larger than myself. A man I never saw directly, but whose presence I sensed in small, careful ways. A car parked slightly too long across the street. A figure near the corner store who never actually bought anything, watched over my building the way Daniel had promised. I told myself it should have unsettled me more than it did. Instead, it became strangely comforting, proof that someone was standing between me and whatever waited in the dark corners of a world I hadn't asked to enter. Daniel came back 3 more times that week, each visit shorter than the one before, each one carrying a little more information than the last. He told me about a woman named Elena, not the barista Grace had mentioned, a different Elena entirely, someone who had worked closely with him for years, someone he had trusted enough to let into rooms where only his most loyal people were allowed. She's the one who let them in that night, he told me, sitting across from me at my small kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea he hadn't touched. I didn't want to believe it at first. I've known her a long time. How long? Since before any of this, he said, gesturing vaguely, as though the word "this" could contain the entire shape of his life. My father built what I run now. Elena's father worked for mine. We grew up in the same rooms, learned the same rules. I trusted her more than almost anyone. What was that like? I asked. Growing up in a world like that? He considered the question longer than I expected. Normal, until it wasn't, he said. When you're young, you don't question the rules of the house you were raised in. You just learn them. It wasn't until I was older that I understood how different my normal was from everyone else's. By then, there wasn't really a way out, even if I had wanted one. My father made sure of that. Did you ever want one? A way out? Once, he said, and something distant crossed his face, quickly hidden again. It doesn't matter now. This is the life I have. I've made peace with most of it. What made you suspect her? Small things, he said. Places I mentioned only to her, that people who shouldn't have known about somehow knew about. A meeting she said she couldn't attend that turned out to be the same night things went wrong. Nothing that would hold up as proof on its own, but enough, together, that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I studied his face as he spoke, the careful way he chose his words, like even now, even after everything, some part of him didn't want to believe what the evidence was telling him. Why would she betray you? Money, most likely, he said. Or fear. Sometimes those are the same thing, just wearing different names. There are people who would pay a great deal to see me gone. If she owed someone, if someone threatened her, there are 100 reasons a person can be pushed into betraying everything they once believed in. Tell me about Victor, I said. If I'm going to understand any of this, I should at least know who I'm supposed to be afraid of. Daniel's expression hardened at the name. Victor Kane inherited a smaller territory than mine, years ago, and has spent every year since trying to grow it at my expense. He's patient, methodical. He doesn't act until he's certain of the outcome, which is what makes him dangerous. Most men in his position act out of anger. Victor never does. Everything he does is calculated. And he wanted you dead because as long as I run things the way my father built them, there's a ceiling on how far Victor can expand, Daniel said. Remove me, and that ceiling disappears, especially if he can do it in a way that looks like an internal collapse rather than an outside attack. Elena's help made that possible. Do you forgive people for that, for being pushed? He looked at me for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. I used to think I could, he said. Before your door. Before I understood what it cost someone innocent when the people around me make choices like that. I didn't fully understand what he meant until he explained the rest, piece by careful piece, over the following days. The attack that had sent him stumbling into my hallway that first night hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been carefully planned, a trap set by a rival named Victor Kane, a man who had spent years circling the edges of Daniel's territory, waiting for the right moment to strike at its center. Elena had given Victor's people the information they needed, the timing, the location, the security gaps that should never have existed. He wanted me dead that night, Daniel said. Not weakened, not warned off, dead. If I hadn't managed to get away, if I hadn't found your door, I wouldn't be sitting here telling you any of this. The weight of that settled over me slowly. The understanding that the man across my kitchen table might never have existed to sit there at all, if not for a single decision I had made in a moment of instinct, half asleep, listening to a storm. I keep thinking about it, I admitted. What would have happened if I hadn't opened the door? Don't, he said, quiet but firm. I think about it enough for both of us. There was something in the way he said it, something that went beyond gratitude, beyond the careful, formal debt he had spoken of that first morning. It scared me a little, how much I wanted to lean into whatever that something was, how much a part of me had started looking forward to the sound of his knock, gentler now than that first desperate pounding, but still enough to make my heart quicken every time. You should be careful, I told him one evening, more to myself than to him, getting attached to someone in the middle of all this. I know, he said. I've told myself the same thing more than once. Has it worked? He gave me a small, tired smile, the kind that carried more honesty than any of his careful, controlled words. Not particularly. I looked away first, unable to hold his gaze, unsettled by how easily he had said what I hadn't been brave enough to say myself. Whatever this was becoming between us, gratitude tangled with fear, tangled with something warmer and more dangerous than either, it had grown roots faster than either of us had planned for, faster than made any sense given how little time had actually passed since that first knock on my door. Grace noticed the change in me before I was ready to admit it out loud. She caught me smiling at my phone one afternoon at work, a simple message from Daniel checking that I'd made it home safely the night before, and raised an eyebrow so pointedly that I nearly knocked my coffee off my desk trying to hide the screen. That's not a secret admirer face, Grace said, grinning. That's a something is definitely happening face. It's complicated, I told her, which was the truest thing I could say without explaining any of it. It's always complicated, she said, right up until it isn't. I wished, more than once in the days that followed, that I could tell her how complicated it truly was, how far beyond an ordinary romance this had already become, but some instinct kept me quiet, some understanding that the less anyone else knew, the safer they would be. The confrontation came on a night I hadn't been expecting it, 10 days after the note had appeared on my counter. I was walking home from a late shift, the streets quieter than usual, when a car pulled up beside me, slow and deliberate, its window rolling down just enough for me to see the man inside. He wasn't anyone I recognized, but something about the way he looked at me, unhurried, certain, told me immediately that this was not a chance encounter. "You've been keeping interesting company," the man said, his voice pleasant in a way that made it worse. I kept walking, my pulse hammering, my hand already fumbling for my phone in my pocket. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Ashcroft," the man said, and my steps faltered despite myself. "He's told you things, hasn't he? About Elena. About who's really behind everything that happened to him." I didn't answer, didn't stop walking, though every instinct in me screamed to run. The car kept pace beside me, unhurried, almost casual, and that casualness terrified me more than any shouted threat could have. "Victor Kane wants you to know something," the man continued. "This isn't your fight. You're just a woman who opened a door on a stormy night. There's still time to walk away from all of it, to go back to whatever quiet little life you had before he showed up on your doorstep. But that time is running out." I finally found my voice, though it shook more than I wanted it to. "Is that a threat?" "It's a courtesy," the man said. "Something Ashcroft's people don't seem to understand anymore. We're not interested in hurting someone who has nothing to do with any of this, yet." The window rolled up before I could respond, and the car sped off, disappearing around the corner before I had even managed to pull my phone free from my pocket. I stood frozen on the sidewalk for a long moment, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts, before I finally forced myself to move, walking the rest of the way home faster than I had ever walked before, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. I called Daniel the moment I locked my apartment door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice trying to dial. He arrived faster than he ever had before, his composure cracking the second he saw my face, saw the way I was still trembling from what had happened. "What did they say to you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous, in a way I hadn't heard from him before. I told him everything, every word the man in the car had said, watching as Daniel's expression darkened with every sentence, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists at his sides before he forced them to relax. "This is exactly what I was trying to prevent," he said, more to himself than to me, pacing the length of my small living room like the walls were too tight to contain whatever he was feeling. "They shouldn't know about you. They shouldn't have any reason to." "Well, they do," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, fear curdling into something closer to anger. "So what happens now?" He stopped pacing and looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that looked almost like fear itself, though not for himself. "Now," he said slowly, "I have a choice to make. I can try to keep you out of this the way I promised, which clearly isn't working. Or I can bring you close enough that no one would dare touch you without starting a war they can't win. Those sound like very different choices." "They are," he agreed, "and I don't have the luxury of pretending either one is simple." I looked at him for a long moment, weighing everything, the danger, the fear, the strange undeniable pull that had been growing between us since that first stormy night. "I already opened the door once," I said finally. "I don't think I get to pretend I can close it now." Something shifted in his expression, resolve settling over the fear, and he nodded slowly, like my words had confirmed something he had already suspected, but hadn't wanted to accept. "Then we do this together," he said, "all the way through." I didn't know exactly what that meant yet, what it would cost either of us before it was over. But I knew, standing there in my apartment, with the echo of Victor Kane's warning still ringing in my ears, that there was no version of my life left that didn't include whatever came next. The choice Grace had joked about weeks ago, some secret admirer, some harmless mystery, had become something else entirely. I wasn't just caught in Daniel Ashcroft's world anymore. I had chosen to stay in it. And somewhere out there, Victor Kane was preparing to make sure that choice cost me everything. The days that followed moved faster than any I had lived through before. Daniel's people were suddenly everywhere, in careful, quiet ways. A new lock on my door that I hadn't asked for. A car that trailed a careful distance behind me whenever I walked to work. A man named Noah, calm and watchful, who introduced himself simply as someone Daniel trusted, positioned near enough to my building that I began to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the stairwell. I should have felt suffocated by it, by the sudden loss of the ordinary, invisible life I had lived before that storm. Instead, I felt something closer to relief, the strange comfort of knowing that, whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it entirely alone. Daniel came to see me less often during those days, and when he did, he looked more tired each time, the calm control I had grown used to fraying slightly at the edges. He was searching for Elena, he told me, trying to find her before Victor could use her for whatever purpose came next, trying to unravel exactly how deep the betrayal went, before it could do any more damage. "I found her," he told me one evening, standing in my doorway rather than coming inside, like he didn't trust himself to stay calm if he sat down. "She's been staying at a property Victor controls. Willingly, it seems. Not a hostage. A partner. What does that mean for what happens next? It means the fight I've been trying to avoid is coming, whether I want it to or not," he said. "Victor's grown bold enough to threaten you directly. That tells me he's preparing to move against me completely, not just circle at the edges anymore. When? Soon," he said. "I can feel it, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks." He was right. 3 nights later, the quiet broke completely. I woke to the sound of my phone ringing at nearly 2 in the morning, Noah's voice on the other end, tense and urgent, in a way that shattered the last remnants of sleep from my mind. "Stay inside," he said. "Lock everything. Don't open the door for anyone but Daniel or me. Something's happening tonight, and I need you safe until it's over." "What's happening?" I asked, already moving through my apartment, checking the locks with hands that trembled despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Victor's making his move," Noah said. "Daniel's meeting him tonight, trying to end this before it spreads any further. I'll be right outside. You're not alone." The line went dead, and I stood in the center of my apartment, the same apartment where all of this had begun, listening to the silence of the city outside, wondering where Daniel was in that moment, wondering if the choice I had made, to stay in this, to stand beside him rather than walk away, was about to be tested in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window instead, watching the empty street below, counting the minutes as they stretched into hours, my phone clutched tightly in my hand, waiting for it to ring again, terrified of what I might hear if it did. At one point, headlights swept slowly across the far end of the street, and I pressed myself back from the glass, heart hammering, until the car simply continued past without slowing. I thought of every conversation Daniel and I had shared since that first storm, every warning, every careful piece of his world he had let me glimpse, and I understood, sitting there in the dark, how small and fragile a single night could be, how quickly everything could tilt one way or the other, before sunrise decided which version of the story I would wake up into. I thought about calling Grace, just to hear an ordinary voice, just to feel for a moment like my life still belonged to the world she lived in. Quiet arguments about deadlines and coffee orders, and nothing more dangerous than office gossip. But I didn't call her. Whatever was happening that night wasn't hers to carry, and some protective instinct in me refused to let it touch her, even from a distance. Around 3 a.m, my phone lit up once with a message from Noah, 3 words only. Still holding steady. I read it a dozen times over the following hour, clinging to it like a small anchor in the middle of a night that refused to end. I thought about texting back, asking for more, but I understood, even in my fear, that every second Noah spent explaining things to me was a second he wasn't watching the street below, and I forced myself to leave him to his work. Around 4 a.m, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Too many, too fast, nothing like the careful, familiar rhythm of Noah's watch. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs, my hand hovering over my phone, ready to call for help the moment I understood what was happening. The knock, when it came, was frantic, urgent, achingly familiar. I looked through the peephole and saw Daniel, blood on his hands, though not, from what I could tell, his own. His eyes wild with an intensity I hadn't seen from him before. "Let me in," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Please, it's over. I need you to let me in." I opened the door immediately, and he stepped inside, his chest heaving like he had run a great distance to get there, his usual composure completely gone, stripped away by whatever had happened in the hours since Noah's call. "What happened?" I asked, my hands already reaching for him, checking for injuries the way I had that very first night, though this time it was fear for him, rather than simple instinct that drove me. "Victor's gone," he said, his voice rough, unsteady. "It's over. Elena too. The people who wanted me dead, who threatened you, who broke into your apartment, they can't hurt either of us anymore. Are you hurt?" "Not badly," he said, though the way he winced when I pressed gently against his side told a different story. "It's not my blood, mostly." I helped him to my couch, the same couch he had collapsed onto weeks before, as a shivering stranger with no name I recognized, and this time I understood exactly who he was, exactly what world he had walked out of and back into my life from, and I found that none of it changed the simple fact that I wanted him safe more than I wanted anything else in that moment. "Tell me what happened," I said, cleaning a shallow cut along his forearm, with hands far steadier than they had been that very first night. He told me slowly, piece by piece, the way he always seemed to share the hardest parts of his world, careful, deliberate, like he was protecting me even now from more than I could handle at once. Victor had tried to ambush him at a meeting meant to broker peace, a final, desperate attempt to seize control before Daniel could consolidate what remained loyal to him. But Daniel's people, warned by information Noah had gathered in the days before, had been ready. "Elena tried to warn me at the last moment," he said quietly. "I think some part of her regretted what she'd done. It wasn't enough to undo the betrayal, but it was enough to give my people the edge they needed." "What happened to her?" "She's alive," he said. "She'll face consequences within my organization, but she's alive." I couldn't bring myself to end it the way some would have expected me to, not after everything. I studied his face as he spoke, searching for regret, for doubt, and found instead a kind of exhausted peace, the look of someone who had carried a great weight for a long time and had finally set it down. "And Victor?" I asked carefully. "He won't threaten either of us again," Daniel said, and something in the finality of his tone told me not to ask for more detail than that. "And your organization?" I asked instead, needing to understand what came next, even if I couldn't fully picture the shape of it. "What happens to it now, with Victor gone and Elena facing whatever consequences you have planned?" "It settles," he said, slowly, probably. "There will be people who test the new balance, who wonder if I'm weaker for what happened. I'll have to answer that, in time, but not tonight. Tonight, I only wanted to know you were safe." "I was," I said. "Noah made sure of that." "I'll thank him properly once I've slept for the first time in 3 days," Daniel said, and the small, tired humor in his voice was, more than anything else he had said, the clearest sign that the danger had truly passed. We sat together in silence for a long while after that, the first true silence we had shared since that stormy night weeks before, one that wasn't heavy with fear or uncertainty, but simply tired, relieved, the quiet that comes after a long, difficult battle has finally ended. "What will you tell your people?" I asked. "About tonight, about Victor, about what comes next." "The truth," he said, "that the threat against us is gone, that anyone still loyal to Victor's ambitions has a choice to make about their future, and that I intend to run things the same way I always have, carefully, and without unnecessary cruelty. Some of them won't like that answer. Most will. And what will you tell them about me?" He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things that mattered. "As much as you're comfortable with," he said. "This isn't a decision I'm going to make for you. You've had enough decisions made around you these past weeks, without your say in them." The thought that he would ask, that he would leave that choice entirely in my hands, after everything that had happened, settled something in my chest that I hadn't realized had still been unsettled. "I keep thinking about that first night," I said eventually, watching the first pale hints of dawn beginning to creep through my curtains, about what would have happened if I hadn't opened the door. "We've had this conversation before," he said, a tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know," I said. "But I think I finally understand the answer now. If I hadn't opened it, I would have gone on living my quiet, ordinary life, safe and untouched by any of this, and I would have never known what it felt like to matter this much to someone, to be protected this fiercely, to choose to stand beside someone, instead of just watching from a distance." He turned to look at me fully then, something soft and unguarded in his expression that I hadn't seen from him before, not even in the quietest moments we had shared. "Is that regret I'm hearing?" he asked. "Or something else?" "Something else," I admitted. "Definitely something else." The sun was fully rising now, spilling gold light across my small apartment, across the same couch where a stranger had once slept, exhausted and afraid. Not yet the man I had come to know, layered and complicated and dangerous, in ways I was still learning to understand. This sunrise felt nothing like that first one, when I had watched him transform from a shivering stranger into someone I barely recognized, someone surrounded by armed men and secrets I hadn't yet been trusted with. This sunrise felt like something closer to a beginning. "What happens now?" I asked, watching the light move slowly across the floor. "Now," Daniel said, reaching over to take my hand in his, steady this time, certain in a way that felt like a promise. "I stop trying to protect you from a distance and start figuring out how to build something real, with you, in the middle of everything I am, if you'll let me." I thought about the door I had opened weeks before, about every choice that had followed it, every moment I could have walked away and hadn't. I thought about fear and danger, and the strange, undeniable way this man had become someone I couldn't imagine my life without, despite everything, despite all the reasons caution should have kept me at a distance. "I already let you in once," I said, echoing words I had said what felt like a lifetime ago. "I don't think I know how to close that door now, even if I wanted to." "Good," he said, quiet and certain, "because I don't want you to." Outside, the city was waking up, ordinary and unaware of everything that had happened in the shadows overnight, unaware of how close 2 lives had come to ending, unaware of how thoroughly they had become intertwined instead. My apartment, small and unremarkable, the same one where a shivering stranger had once begged for shelter from a storm, had become something else entirely. It had become the place where everything changed. Not because I had opened a door to danger that first stormy night, though I had, but because I had chosen, every day since, not to close it again. By sunrise, all those weeks ago, a stranger had become the most powerful man in a world I never knew existed. But by this sunrise, something more important had happened. He had simply become mine, and I, without any hesitation left in me at all, had become his.